So, I mean, it really comes down to that, there needs to be kind of a systematic change in the political landscape in the state of Maine, which I certainly do agree. And that is I'm going to make a shameless plug for, Maine First Project. That is the goal of the organization,
Yep.
is doing that. But, at the same time, it goes even further. I think that everything is tied in, where we need to change the political landscape in Maine to foster industry, like Heather was saying, to the state and make it so that businesses want to come up to Maine. Like they're doing in New Hampshire and so forth. And there is a huge issue when it comes to just opportunities in industry in the state of Maine. I mean, that is one of the big issues that we're facing today. And it's also, coming to fruition in some other states in New England in general. So my question is, what laws do we need to do to pass to kind of attract more industry so that we can gain more job opportunities for young people in the state of Maine? What say you, Heather?
Well, the things that business owners complain about as roadblocks are the high cost of energy and high taxes. And those are two things that we could make a dent with if we really wanted to. And Paul LePage and the Republicans beat our heads against the wall for 8 years just trying to get hydropower, lifting the 100 megawatt cap. And unfortunately, we just couldn't seem to get that done.
Or even a modest reduction in the state income tax was hard fought.
No, it doesn't. I mean, aside from Governor LePage, it seems like the issue is systematic not only with the progressives on the left side of the aisle, but Republicans as well.
Sure. Can I jump in here?
I mean, if we were going to slam Republicans, we lost the 100 megawatt, lifting the 100 megawatt cap from legislators that were representing districts that had paper mills that were involved with biomass, and they didn't want to hurt their area. And then guess what? A year or two later, those paper mills were closed. And so they cast that vote, and we lost our 2-year opportunity to get things done. And it was too late after that. And so Republicans did make some mistakes, being very short-sighted and worrying about one industry in their district because it was the last thing left other than those jobs at schools and those jobs at hospitals. And so when you are representing a poor rural district, you have you need to listen carefully to what's left, even if it's dying. And unfortunately, we had a small window of opportunity that we just couldn't make it happen. And when you're on your last legs, like a lot of businesses in the state of Maine, they're desperate to try to stay open and keep open, and they apply pressure on their legislators, and they couldn't get the votes to look long term at what would be better for the whole state of Maine. Yeah, when you're a legislator, you are representing your district, but you're also an employee, literally, of the state of Maine, and the decisions you make are affecting the whole state, not just one paper mill in one town in your district. And that was frustrating to me to see that just could not seem to convince Republican legislators they needed to be looking at the bigger picture. They just wouldn't do it. And a lot of the legislators are married to people that work in mills or have parents, relatives, whatever, that work in those mills. And that was it's things like that that make it really hard to change make significant changes that are going to pinch in the short term for a small segment of people and help overall.
And historically, talk about Republicans enabling what's happened to this state. Rewind 50 years, 1969, 51 years now. Ken Curtis was a Democrat governor. The Republicans had majorities in both houses of the legislature. And that was the year we enacted the state income tax. It needed a 2/3 vote in both chambers, which Republicans had majorities. That's where it came from. The tax, when it was passed, the top rate was 6% on income over $50,000. By the time Paul LePage became governor, the top rate was 8.5%, and it kicked in at $19,500 a year. So over a period of half century, they ratcheted it up so that, and in fact, $50,000 in 1969 would be the equivalent of $320,000 today. So if the rates had kept pace with inflation, the top rate of 6% would have kicked in at $320,000. As I said, no, the top rate then kicked in at 8.5% on $19,500, and we're right next to a store that has no state income tax. So that's the sad history of the Republican Party in Maine as far as the legislature. By the way, that was a 37% increase in the biennial budget that year. But imagine that. We're stunned at this 11% that they just put through.
Well, if you also look back at the original legislative calendars, you'll notice that prior to the implementation of the income tax, the legislature only met the first year of the biennial session. And the second year truly was for emergencies only. And it wasn't until we had this extra influx of cash that the legislators all of a sudden had to start meeting every year.
And we built the welfare state. The state income tax was ground zero for the growth of the welfare state. One other thought just occurred to me. I remember in Tom Sawyer, when he was elected to the state senate from Bangor, I think it was in 2002, the Old Town Mill was still operating. Georgia Pacific owned the mill. 600 employees right up the river from where I am in Old Town. And I remember Tom Sawyer had a graph, and it showed all of the Georgia Pacific paper mills in the country. There was about a dozen of them. And it was a chart that showed the cost of producing a ton of paper. And the Old Town Mill in Maine was off the charts, higher than all the others. Combination of energy costs, taxes, workers' comp, everything else. And I remember Sawyer saying at the time, he said, sooner or later, those jobs will go away. The people who own Georgia Pacific stock and the executives there are looking at that, and there's no way that continues. And again.
Well, how about right to work? I think that is also, a big factor when it comes to this stuff as well, which Republicans also failed to pass when they had the chance.
Here's a commoner's. Oh, I'm sorry. You keep going with your thought.
No. Go ahead.
Here's a commoner's.
There in the 125th, and we had a majority. We had a shot at passing right to work. What happened, Heather?
Well, they wouldn't even bring it up for a vote. We had a caucus, and they were going to let us know that we were not going to be voting on fair share or right to work. And the legislators went through the roof, especially the freshmen, and were absolutely infuriated. Amy Volk from inside the caucus, which you're not supposed to do, sent a text message to Ray Richardson. Ray Richardson happened to be on the phone with Governor LePage at the time, and from what I understand, some of the words that came out of the governor's mouth were not repeatable, and he was absolutely infuriated to discover, one, we should have never found out that way, but people were extremely upset, and no one really knew exactly what happened as to why we were not even allowed to have a vote on that issue, but we were not allowed to vote on it.
And after a
heard all
10-hour,
kinds of rumors.
yeah, there was a 10-hour long public hearing in the Labor Committee. The feedback I was getting at the time, and I had not even decided to be a candidate at that time, but what I was hearing was that, we only had a 1-vote majority in the House, Heather, or 2?
No, it's about 3.
And there were 2 Republican legislators who had apparently promised constituents when they were campaigning that they wouldn't support a right-to-work bill. And if we lost those 2 votes, then we lost the bill. And instead of leadership taking those 2 legislators aside and telling them, you know what, we're going to go in the House chamber there in about a half hour, and we're going to have a roll call vote on this. And if you're on the wrong side of it, that's your problem, not mine. And that's the time when leadership should have twisted some arms. We let that opportunity slip away, and probably not going to get a shot at that again for a while.
So James, what are
I
your
mean,
thoughts?
obviously, I agree with what has been said already, but just a commoner's perspective here. 2 points. Maine was incorporated as a state in the latter part of the 18th century. In every
This year.
every legislative session, we pass, correct me if I'm wrong, close to, if not over, 2,000 new bills. My first thought would be, do we need any more laws at this point? And if you're going to pass a law, let's pass a law that does no harm. Who said do no harm? Is it Reagan? I forget. But in general, get the boot of government off the necks of producers, as you guys have already said. But when you look at some of the laws that have been passed this last session, the minimum wage increase, that hurts the young. We were told emphatically that the cost of things weren't going to go up. Well, gee, Wally, they have. And so now there's competition. You're going to have a skill set, because even at Dunkin' Donuts, it's dog eat dog, or Walmart or whatever. The fuel tax, I think it was Andrew McLean, the alternative fuel tax. I don't know if it was last session or the 128th. But the idea that you push people to drive Priuses, and because you're not getting now that there's not a handful, but there's a certain number of people driving the hybrids to where it's causing somewhat of an impact to the overall tax base. So now they want to the initiative is to tax these guys at a certain level, and other looking at some of the other bills, like as they're passing taxpayer-funded abortion, which goes directly to population issues, is another form of taxation on the producers. At the same time, they're advocating compassion for the young mother who can't take responsibility or doesn't, whatever the reason is. They're advocating for help there. They're doing away with the balloon to save the sea turtle, changing the paper bag into plastic, or taking the plastic bags off the market and putting the paper bag. All this stuff has a cost to it. Now you go into the local grocery store and you have to pay for worthless paper bags. It raises costs, and then the young who have relatively little experience, their potential employers have to be fairly selective if they're going to stay viable. So that my first thought was, how about no more legislation for a while, or pass legislation that does no harm, and going back to abortion for a second, if the current levels are the same, relatively the same, and to my knowledge, if they're not the same, they're only worse. Going all the way back to 1973, the onset of Roe v. Wade, we've aborted enough babies to obliterate the cities of Portland and Lewiston, roughly 90,000 babies. If we hadn't done that, we wouldn't have a demographic winner. So it's these people have to be checked at some point if posterity's going to have something. So I wouldn't pass any new law. I would start with repealing plenty of them. A push
Or at
for
least repeal 2 old ones for every new one.
yeah. That's a good thought. Certainly, we can do that.
Well, maybe we could pass a constitutional amendment that you have to repeal 2 laws in order to pass one law.
And just in fairness, we don't pass 2,000 bills every session. There's roughly that many or more introduced, but 700 or 800 of them get through.
Yeah, right. Considered, I meant. Yeah, you're right.
So
Okay, well, I mean, what are folks' final thoughts on this issue? This is kind of open-ended to anyone, whoever wants to go first.
well, I think state government needs to shift resources from the 4-year degree programs and from K through 12 to vocational training and education, because if they learn a trade and they haven't accumulated a lot of debt, what's a 2-year program at community college cost? $15,000, maybe 20.
Probably not even that.
If that.
Yeah.
And when you come out, you can get a decent paying job, you can start a family, and you can stay in Maine. And at some level, it is that simple. And that's why the left hates shop class, they hate industrial arts, they hate the trades.
And they hate fun.
They hate fun.
They hate fun. The state is boring. We gotta make the state more fun for kids to stay.
Well, the solution certainly isn't. I know some of them down there. Diane Russell no longer serves in the legislature, but just to single her out, they really believe that more drugs and more gambling is the key to economic growth. The marijuana industry is going to create all these new jobs, and more gambling and more drugs.
Bread and games. Bread and games.
Bread and circuses. Yep.
Yep. Bread and circuses. Bread and circuses. I mean, it works. It works great for Vegas, though. I have to say that.
Yeah.
Vegas.
And the challenge for us, at Maine First Project, we want to transform the political landscape in Maine so that the voters have some choices and they can put people in office who are going to follow through on this stuff. It's an enormous challenge to find those candidates and train them. And just maybe as a side note, we have a part-time citizen legislature. That's a good thing. I don't want a full-time professional legislature where they're in session all year long and you pay them 80 or 90 grand a year. It's similar to what we're doing in Massachusetts. The downside of the part-time citizen legislature is that it's tough to find candidates, particularly if they're long distance from Augusta. If you live in Aroostook County or Washington County, that means spending most of your time in Augusta for 6 months one year and 4 months the next. And that's a challenge, but we're gonna work through it, aren't we, Heather?
Absolutely. absolutely ready.
Well, I mean, just to add on to one thing. I'm sorry, Heather, to interrupt real quick here. But, you know, it's not just a matter of finding candidates. It's, we need to lobby these candidates. You know, we don't, you know, directly electioneer or any of that, but we do need to, you know, push these candidates who are running to have the right value sets when they're running for office, and you know, they need to be afraid of their constituents more than they are afraid of you know, the leftists, media and ideals. So,
Heather, you were starting to say something there.
Well, I was just going to say that it was disappointing for me to discover that a lot of legislators don't seem to have any core to refer to make decisions on any given bill. Where are their principles? That they don't have any, basically, because their background is so poor. Their education on basic civics and history and government is almost non-existent. And when candidates are recruited, because we're trying to recruit here in Scarborough, the criteria are not, well, do they understand how government works? Do they understand that businesses are struggling and this is why? Do they understand what it is they're going to be asked to do when they get to Augusta? No. Do they have name recognition? Are they likable? Are they electable? That's about it. So, and do they have the right letter next to their name? So there's to recruit people, they're not looking for candidates that will make good legislators. They're looking for candidates that can win. And that's a big difference. So once you get these people elected, and the Democrats know this, the Democrats do the same thing. They're not looking for someone who believes in all of the Democrat principles and knows all their talking points. They're looking for someone that's likable and electable in their district. And once they get elected, they immediately throw them into a very intense training session. Republicans have no training. There's nothing. So you don't have any kind of informational guidance or expectation on any given issue. So let's just take minimum wage, for instance. I mean, we would talk about it in caucus a little, but we didn't have any in-depth training sessions, whereas the Democrats literally have this huge slideshow projector in the appropriations room, and they'll go in once a week and have demonstrations and all sorts of guest speakers come in and try to educate their members. So when you have a bill come up on the floor and it deals with minimum wage, boom, they just hit the button, stand up, and they don't need a pre-written speech. They've already been brainwashed into all their talking points, and they could just stand up and spit them out. And we just sit there and look at each other. We kind of stumble around, and I have someone stand up and spurt out something, but we don't have all the members trained or educated on our views on issues, and they might intuitively sort of know it's wrong, but they can't articulate it. We need to have our legislators better educated.
Yeah.
And as Zach said, trying to sort of lobby them is another way to educate them. So if you can sit down with any of them, whether they're a freshman or not, and build a relationship with them and explain to them your views on whatever it is, whether if you want right to work or whether you want to lower the income tax, whatever it might be, it's worth taking the time to try to inform them and get them educated, because they're not going to get information from many places.
And then, yes, and as it gets closer to a key vote. Hopefully they've been educated. That's the time when we want to instill fear in them, because legislators fear nothing so much as losing the next election. And as Zach has said in the past, we want them to be more afraid of us than they are of the left-wing media or the Marxist People's Alliance or the teachers' union thugs or whoever it is. And that's
and
just...
to help give them, make them brave, they need to be able to easily and quickly articulate why they're voting a certain way. You can't just say to them, "This is a bad bill," which we would hear over and over again in caucus. "Oh no, you gotta vote against this. It's a bad bill." Well, I need a little more than that. Can you explain the bill? Can you articulate it to the rest of the caucus? I mean, I don't know everything about marine resources or whatever committee that bill may be coming from, but oftentimes the Republicans' attitude was, "It's a bad bill," and that's it. That is the extent of it. So I think that, yeah, we need to make them afraid, but we also can look at it in a different way and say we need to give them a little courage. And there's nothing like feeling comfortable with the bill as long as you have the information you need and you can just spit it right out. Defend your position.
You got a sidekick there, Larry.
Yeah, the cat's discovered the podcast. What's going on down here? He's asking.
I guess I would close with John Taylor Gatto. I don't know if you guys know who he is. I think he died last year. He's been a man who's pretty instrumental in the last, in shaping my mind the last decade or so. He's an advocate, or was an advocate, of what's called open source, or what is called open source learning, where you cater education. There's a difference between schooling and education, is his premise. Our American school systems, they're really good at schooling, and when he first said this metaphor, it kind of didn't sit right. But he compares the American school system with he says it's a prison, and I just the thought about open source learning is when who knows the child better than the parent. The idea that the state knows best is really foreign to the human experience. He in the book that I have here is called The Underground History of American Education. He lists, because Heather's talking about the fact that politicians, they just start out and they're misinformed about just simple civics. But how about the American experience when you have progressives today revising American history, whitewashing it, making it, taking things like Columbus Day and transforming it, and calling Columbus a racist and all this stuff. John Taylor Gatto's thoughts in this book, he says, the original American curriculum, I'm talking about the Native Americans and how they raised their kids. 1 is discipline. Reliability was highly prized. 2 is fortitude. Complaining was unacceptable. 3, independence. Depending on others was bad form. 4, audacity. Reckless courage in battle was expected. 5, passion. Emotional commitment to the task at hand was the community standard. 6, perseverance. One must never surrender or quit a task before completed. 7, filial piety. Taking care of one's parents was customary. 8, honor. Absolute honesty was required. Lying was unforgivable, as it is under our perjury laws in courtrooms and considered a serious crime. 9, resolve. Pledges and promises are sacred. 10 is adaptability. Be flexible in widely varying circumstances. 11, resistance to oppression. Indians were loath to follow orders. Even chiefs had little authority to command. Compliance was voluntary except in combat. And the last one, 12, loyalty to tribe, allegiance to one's community as a whole was absolute. That all flies in the face of what our kids are taught today. They're taught to have safe spaces, and that their opinion, their emotions are more important than facts and all the rest of it. So I mentioned him to pretty much, just I guess a small point to make here is the parent is the authority, and we can all take, as dire as it may look, and I am naturally a pessimist, when you look at the culture and the conditions and the political landscape, the first inclination is to say, well, what can I do about it? The parent can change life in a nanosecond for the family. And my encouragement to the electorate would be to, start with your kid. Don't, the state might be dismantling ideology that's instilled in the home, but there's a lot you can do to check that, starting with time well spent. And, reading books about American history and asking the child what he's learning in school, and giving the counter narrative. Just my 2 cents.
Well, this was a great podcast, guys. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and very informative. I've personally learned a lot, and I do thank you guys for taking the time out of your evening to do this. And we are just in closing for our viewers. We will be doing these podcasts. What we're going to shoot for every other week, and we'll have some short snippets in between those times as well. So please stay tuned, and I really appreciate it. And if you could, please go down and either, if you liked this discussion or didn't, please show your feelings, comment, like or dislike this video. And also, if you could subscribe to our channel, that would be great. Maine First Project channel would be great. And check us out on our website as well, www.mainefirstproject.org. That is www.mainefirstproject.org. All right, guys. Well, you guys have a good evening, and we will talk soon.
Good night, everybody.
Yeah.
I'm going to start with telling you a different way that this was done and is being done now under our noses, but it isn't touching nearly enough of us. The school question of the moment is this: can we create more sensible uses for the time of America's young than sentencing them to bells and chair time and memory drills for 12 years? What might we do instead? What we might think about doing before we thought about specifics is making gigantic cracks in this Prussian machine. We can't abandon it because it's the leading employer in the United States if you factor in all of the collateral businesses that depend on schooling, like textbooks and driving the truck to deliver the textbooks, etc. I call the process that I think we need to evolve to, or devolve to, since we had it at one time. I call it open source learning. And rather than define that for you right away, I'm going to illustrate it at work with living examples. My first example of open source learning is an automobile mechanic who dropped out of junior high school at the age of 13. His name is Jonathan Goodwin, and if you're on the internet, you can Google the cover of Fast Company magazine for November 2007. And you'd be looking square in the face, the homely face, I might add, although my editor objected to me saying, I'm sure Jonathan wouldn't object, of a dirt poor kid from a Kansas farm family of 7 kids, drops out of junior high school at 13 and does what innumerable kids do and have done. He hangs out at the local garage. Can you see any future for Jonathan Goodwin? How on earth does he go from there in 20 years to the cover of Fast Company magazine? As he told Fast Company, after dropping out of 7th grade, he made a living rebuilding cars ruined in accidents. He bought the wrecks for a few bucks and made them, I'm quoting, good as new. That was my school, said Jonathan. Even as a teenager, Jonathan could see that technology already existed to get between 60 and 100 miles a gallon, 100 on an ordinary car, 60 miles a gallon on a Hummer. How about that? He saw that it was easy to double the horsepower and to push the emissions close to zero. And why, he asked himself at about age 15, wasn't Detroit doing this? You and I know, but Jonathan didn't know. I can do it myself, he thought. So living in California, he began to offer conversions for a Hummer. He'd guarantee you 60 miles to a gallon. You pay him $25,000. But with gas at $4 a gallon and a Hummer getting about 3 to 4 miles to a gallon, you can make that 25 grand up pretty quickly. Did people laugh at this cheeky kid? No, they lined up, giving him more business than he could handle. And his best customer was the governor of California, Arnold Schwarzenegger, who owned 7 Hummers. That was 175 grand right there, and it took Jonathan 50 days. Today he does 4 a month, 48 a year, and his income is more than $1 million per annum.